you've been trying to understand something about yourself for longer than you'd like to admit. The subconscious mind doesn't speak in sentences. Science has known this for decades. The deeper layers of cognition communicate through symbol, image, and pattern, a code running beneath the language you use every day. The brain that decodes the world in words is not the same brain that processes emotion. And here is the part that matters. The more you try to translate what's inside using words alone, the more something essential refuses to come through. Welcome to Sleepy Science. Tonight, the answer is not in the translation. It's in learning to read the language that was already there. Close your eyes. Let your breath soften. You are already inside it, the quiet code the mind uses when words aren't enough. The first fact is waiting. The word symbol comes from the Greek symbolon, a broken object whose two halves could be rejoined to confirm identity. In the ancient world, allies would split a clay tablet or coin, each keeping one half. Reunion of the pieces was proof of trust. The deeper mind does something structurally similar. It splits complex emotional experience into fragments. Image, sensation, scenes, and encodes each one separately. The process isn't randomness. It is a compression algorithm built over millions of years of evolution. Packaging what language cannot carry into forms the deeper processing system can hold and move. Symbolism, in the brain's original use of the word, is how it recognizes itself across time. The human brain processes roughly 11 million bits of information per second, but conscious awareness handles only about 50 of them. The rest, the vast overflow of sensation, emotion, association, and memory, is processed below the threshold of language. This is not a design flaw. It is an efficiency system. The brain's bandwidth for imagistic processing is estimated to be many orders of magnitude larger than its linguistic channel. What you experience as intuition, as a feeling you cannot name, as a recurring image that carries weight, these are the outputs of that larger system, surfacing in the only form it knows how to use. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, proposed in the early 20th century that symbols function as psychological bridges, structures that allow unconscious material to pass into conscious awareness without losing its emotional charge. Modern neuroscience has provided anatomical support for something like this idea. The amygdala, which processes emotional memory, communicates extensively with the visual cortex and hippocampus, but has limited direct connection to Broca's area, the region associated with speech production. Emotional content routinely travels routes that bypass language entirely. The imagistic symbol is not a primitive substitute for verbal thought. It is the native language of systems that predate verbal thought by hundreds of millions of years, the first form the brain learned to use. Dreams are the most studied context for imagistic cognition, but they are not the only one. Daydreams, intrusive images, emotional associations triggered by music or smell, the mental imagery that accompanies memory retrieval. All of these engage the same processing systems. Research using functional MRI has shown that when people describe emotionally significant experiences, activity in the visual cortex often precedes or accompanies activity in language areas. The brain sees the memory before it speaks it. This sequence is not a malfunction. It reflects the architecture of how emotional knowledge is stored. First as scene, then as narrative. The image always earlier in the chain. The amygdala stores what researchers call emotional signatures. Rapid, image-linked summaries of past experiences that carry evaluative weight. When you encounter something that resembles a past threat or reward, the amygdala fires before the prefrontal cortex has time to form a verbal assessment. This is the neural basis of what people describe as a gut feeling. The amygdala is not generating language. It is generating something closer to a scene, a compressed sensory-emotional snapshot of what happened last time something similar occurred. The deeper mind is fast and non-verbal, not because it is primitive, but because speed and compression require a different encoding format than deliberate speech. In cultures separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, certain symbolic themes appear with striking consistency. Water representing transition. Fire representing transformation. The descent into underground spaces representing access to hidden knowledge. Researchers studying mythology across unrelated traditions have catalogued hundreds of these recurring motifs. The Jungian concept of archetypes proposed that they arise from shared human biology rather than cultural exchange. Contemporary cognitive science approaches the same phenomenon through the lens of evolved cognitive defaults, patterns that brains with similar architecture tend to generate under similar conditions. The symbols are not identical across cultures, but the underlying logic repeats because the underlying brain repeats. Emotional memory and episodic memory are stored through overlapping but distinct neural systems. The hippocampus encodes the timeline and context of an experience. The amygdala encodes the emotional weight, the felt quality of it. When something imagistic surfaces in awareness, it often carries that weight without narrative context. A feeling of significance attached to an image whose origin you cannot trace. This dissociation is not unusual. Research shows that emotionally significant events can leave stable amygdala-based traces even when hippocampal context memory is incomplete or unavailable. The image without the story is not an error. It is the deeper record, intact, waiting for the context to catch up. The brain's default mode network, the constellation of regions most active during rest, self-reflection, and mind-wandering, has been found to engage heavily with imagistic and narrative processing rather than literal verbal tasks. When you are not focused on an external goal, the brain does not go quiet. It runs its own operations. Consolidating memory, constructing self-narrative, simulating future scenarios. Much of this activity unfolds in visual spatial terms rather than language. The mind at rest is not idle. Right now, your default mode network is doing exactly this. The mind you brought to this hour is already quietly sorting itself. The deeper language is already running. Sleep plays an essential role in imagistic consolidation. During REM sleep, the brain replays emotionally significant memories and strips their autonomic charge, the physical arousal component, while preserving the informational content. Researchers at UC Berkeley have described this process as overnight therapy. The emotional memory is accessed in a neurochemical environment low in norepinephrine, which allows the content to be processed without retriggering the stress response. What re-emerges in consciousness after REM is often the same material transformed, not erased, but processed. The recurring image that shifts meaning after sleep is not imagination. It is the deeper processing completing its own consolidation cycle. So the deeper mind does not speak in words because words arrived late in the brain's evolutionary timeline. The imagistic systems are older and more deeply integrated with the body's emotional architecture. What we call intuition, the weight of certain images, the emotional charge that attaches to dreams and reverie, these are not secondary to language. They are the primary data stream. Language describes what the deeper system has already processed. What cannot be said is not necessarily unknown. It may be known in a language that precedes speech, and the gap between that knowing and its translation into words is not a failure. It is the natural distance between two different kinds of mind. The study of how the brain represents abstract concepts has undergone significant revision in the past 2 decades. Early cognitive models assumed that abstract ideas, fairness, time, the future, were represented in purely logical, language-based formats. Contemporary research has challenged this. Embodied cognition theory, supported by neuroimaging data, proposes that abstract concepts are grounded in sensorimotor experience and represented partly through simulation of bodily states. The concept of warmth activates circuits associated with physical warmth. The concept of holding on activates circuits associated with grasping. Abstract meaning is not language-independent code. It is built from the same imagistic, embodied substrate as the deeper language the mind uses first. Metaphor is not a literary device applied to thought after the fact. Linguistic research by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson established that human conceptual systems are fundamentally metaphorical in structure. We understand abstract domains through the language and imagery of more concrete physical domains. Time is understood spatially. The future is ahead. The past is behind. Emotional states are understood as physical locations. Falling into depression, rising to a challenge. The brain does not generate abstract concepts first and then translate them into metaphor. The imagistic pattern that carries the concept is the concept, shaped by the same encoding systems the deeper mind uses by default. The distinction between the conscious and the pre-verbal mind is not a boundary between the logical and the illogical. Research in implicit cognition has demonstrated that below-threshold processing follows consistent, rule-governed patterns unconscious priming, implicit memory, and conditioned emotional associations all show systematic, predictable structure. What the deeper mind lacks is not rationality. What it lacks is sequential verbal articulation. Its logic is parallel, associative, and imagistic rather than serial and propositional. Calling this processing irrational is like calling music incoherent because it cannot be parsed as prose. The form is different. The intelligence is not, and neither is the coherence behind it. Body language is one of the most accessible windows into pre-verbal processing. Research in social and affective neuroscience consistently finds that the body encodes emotional states through posture, gesture, facial expression, and autonomic signals, all before verbal awareness. People contract and expand physically in response to approach and avoidance motivation. The chest compresses under shame. The throat tightens before a difficult truth. These are not learned performances. They are the deeper system expressing its current evaluation through the body's native vocabulary. The body is not a container for the mind. It is the medium through which the older processing layer communicates what it has not yet formed into words. Color carries weight that is partially cross-cultural and partially culturally specific. Studies across diverse populations have found consistent associations between certain colors and emotional states: blue and calm, red and urgency, green and safety, though the precise quality of these associations varies. At the neural level, color processing and emotional processing are not cleanly separated. The limbic system influences color perception, and color input reaches emotional processing areas rapidly, ahead of full cortical analysis. The emotional response to color is not aesthetic preference applied after seeing. It arrives with the seeing. Part of the evaluation the deeper mind runs before consciousness catches up. The phenomenon of déjà vu, the sense of having experienced something before, attached to a moment you are certain is new, is now understood as a memory error involving pattern matching. The hippocampus continuously scans incoming sensory data for matches against stored experience. When a new scene shares enough structural or visual features with a stored memory to trigger a partial match, the familiarity signal fires without a clear narrative source. The feeling of already known is real. The referent is simply absent. The recognition system ran correctly, pattern matching across images, but surfaced without the context that would make the match legible. Music activates imagistic and emotional processing simultaneously, in a way that verbal language does not. Neuroimaging studies have consistently shown that music engages the limbic system, the cerebellum, the motor cortex, and the default mode network in patterns that overlap with emotionally significant memory retrieval. A piece of music can reconstruct an emotional context more completely than a verbal description of the same experience. This is because music encodes information in the non-verbal channels: rhythm, timbre, harmonic movement, that the older processing system uses for its own encoding. Music speaks the same native language. That is why it reaches what words cannot. The limbic system, which mediates emotional processing, developed earlier in evolutionary history than the prefrontal cortex, which supports rational deliberation and verbal reasoning. This temporal sequence has structural consequences. The limbic system has dense reciprocal connections with sensory processing areas, memory systems, and autonomic regulation. Its outputs reach the body rapidly. The prefrontal cortex receives input from limbic structures and can modulate their output. But this modulation is slower and metabolically expensive. The emotional response is not something that reasoning corrects after the fact. It is the first response, and the body has already begun to move before the verbal mind has finished deciding what to do about it. Intrusive thoughts, unwanted images or scenes that surface without intention, are now understood as part of the normal monitoring function of the deeper mind. The brain maintains a low-level scan for unresolved material, incomplete emotional processing, and potential threats. Intrusive imagery is not a malfunction. It is the pre-verbal system flagging something it has not finished encoding. Research on thought suppression, conducted by Daniel Wegner and colleagues, demonstrated that actively trying to suppress a specific thought reliably increases its frequency. The ironic process theory. The material the deeper mind marks as significant cannot be dismissed by force. It can only be processed. Ritual behavior across cultures involves symbolic action, physical enactment of abstract states or intentions. Washing as purification, fire as transformation, threshold crossing as transition. Anthropologists studying ritual have noted that these behaviors engage the body in the language of the deeper mind, producing measurable shifts in physiological and psychological state. Controlled studies have shown that ritualized behavior reduces anxiety before high-stakes events, independent of any supernatural belief. The effect appears to work through the pre-verbal processing system. The body enacting the symbolic structure sends the signal that a transition is occurring. The conscious mind knows the ritual is not magic. The body processes it as real. Art therapy and expressive art approaches are grounded in the observation that imagistic production can allow emotional processing that verbal narration cannot. When individuals who have experienced trauma are asked to draw, paint, or arrange symbolic objects representing their experience, distinct neural and behavioral outcomes emerge, compared to purely verbal processing. Research using neuroimaging has found that art making engages limbic memory structures and the anterior cingulate cortex in ways that verbal recall does not always replicate. The image created by the hand carries information that the sentence spoken by the mouth is not structured to hold. Both are true. Only one reaches the full record. Dreams involving falling, being chased, teeth falling out, or showing up unprepared for an examination are among the most commonly reported across populations worldwide. The universality of these scenarios, across cultures without direct contact, suggests they are generated by shared neural architecture rather than shared cultural narrative. Research on dream content has found consistent correlations between these themes and activation of specific stress-related neural circuits. The falling dream is associated with hypnic jerk, the muscle twitch at sleep onset that reflects the brain's monitoring of body position during the transition between wakefulness and sleep. The image is not invented. It has a neural address. The hippocampus performs something neuroscientists call pattern completion, the ability to reconstruct a full memory from a partial cue. A fragment of sensory information, a smell, a texture, a visual pattern, can trigger retrieval of an entire emotional contextual scene. This mechanism is why images carry the weight they do. An image is a compressed sensory cue that, when encountered, completes the pattern of a larger emotional structure. You do not need the full story to feel the full weight. The fragment carries the charge of the whole. This is not poetic association. It is the hippocampus running the deeper language from any available starting point. The concept of emotional granularity, the ability to make fine-grained distinctions between emotional states, has been found to be associated with psychological resilience and well-being. Individuals with high emotional granularity are better able to identify, name, and regulate their emotional states. What is less often noted is that this granularity can be developed through engagement with metaphorical and artistic forms, through learning the richer vocabulary the pre-verbal mind already uses. Poetry, music, visual art, and narrative fiction do not merely represent emotional states. They train the emotional encoding system to produce more detailed, more usable representations. The deeper mind becomes more articulate. 25 facts in, and the pattern is already visible. The pre-verbal processing system is not a dark room where irrational impulses hide. It is the primary system of the emotional and imagistic mind, older, faster, and more densely connected to the body than the verbal systems layered on top. The images it produces are not noise. They are compressed data, encoded in the language the brain built first. What speaks in images? What surfaces in dreams? What attaches emotional weight to a scent or a color or a piece of music? These are not mysteries to be decoded. They are the mind reading itself. The next arc follows what happens when that reading meets the systems that were built to suppress it. You're still here with us, and that means everything. A gentle subscribe helps another sleepless mind find their way home. Let's take a breath together now. One quiet mind finding its way home. Right now, the images this hour has been naming are traveling the same pathways that carry every image your mind has ever produced. They are moving through the visual cortex, through the hippocampus, through the amygdala that holds the emotional weight, not to be decoded immediately, to be held. The way any language is held before it is fully understood. You don't need to translate what you've heard tonight. Something in the deeper system already recognizes it. What you haven't heard yet is what happens when that recognition meets the part of the mind that learned, very early, to look away. That is where Fact 26 begins. Now we continue. The mechanisms by which emotionally significant material is kept from conscious awareness have been studied extensively since Freud, but the contemporary neuroscientific account differs substantially from the classical psychoanalytic model. The prefrontal cortex can actively suppress activity in the hippocampus and amygdala through top-down inhibition. Research by Michael Anderson at Cambridge has used functional MRI to demonstrate that deliberate not thinking, attempting to keep a specific memory out of awareness, produces measurable suppression of hippocampal activity. The neural machinery for keeping things below consciousness is real, functionally distinct, and metabolically costly. The mind pays a resource price to maintain what it will not look at. Repression, in the contemporary neuroscientific sense, is not a theoretical construct. Research using neural feedback techniques has suggested that repeated suppression of a specific memory trace can weaken its hippocampal representation over time. The memory becomes harder to access, its emotional signature less vivid. What is significant is that this suppression can occur without the content disappearing entirely. It may remain in the system, just less retrievable. The residue persists in associative networks even when the episodic narrative has degraded. The deeper mind retained what the conscious system had been working to release. The image can stay even when the story fades. Dissociation, the partial or complete disconnection of emotional content from its narrative source, is now understood as a dimensional trait present to varying degrees in the general population, not only in clinical conditions. Everyday dissociation includes highway hypnosis, absorption in music or film, and the experience of moving through a familiar routine without conscious attention. In all of these states, processing continues. The pre-verbal system remains active, encoding and evaluating. What changes is the connection between that processing and the verbal, narrative self-awareness that usually accompanies it. The deeper language continues its work whether or not the observing mind is present. The system is patient. It does not need acknowledgement to keep doing its work. The anterior cingulate cortex plays a central role in monitoring discrepancy, detecting mismatch between expected and actual outcomes, between what is said and what is meant, between stated values and enacted behavior. It fires in response to cognitive conflict, error detection, and emotional pain. When the imagistic content of the deeper mind conflicts with the conscious narrative the person is maintaining, the anterior cingulate registers the mismatch. This is the neurological basis of the feeling that something isn't right, even when the words for it aren't there. The monitor is always running. It does not require language to report its findings. Somatic symptom research has documented the ways in which unprocessed emotional content finds expression through the body when verbal pathways are unavailable or bypassed. Chronic pain, fatigue, gastrointestinal disturbance, and skin responses have all been associated in controlled research with psychological stress that is not being consciously processed. The term alexithymia, difficulty identifying and describing emotional states in words, is associated with elevated rates of somatic symptom presentation. The body speaks when the verbal system cannot or will not. This is not metaphor. It is the pre-verbal system routing its output through the physiological channel because the conscious channel is occupied elsewhere. And the body's timing is rarely wrong. Research on the return of the repressed, the phenomenon in which actively suppressed material surfaces with increased intensity after the suppression effort is released, has been replicated across multiple laboratory paradigms. Wegner's work on thought suppression showed that subjects asked not to think of a white bear during a suppression period. I thought of it more frequently during a subsequent free thought period than subjects who had never suppressed. The material the deeper mind has flagged as significant is not neutralized by suppression. The energy invested in keeping it out of awareness becomes the energy that drives it back. This is not a flaw in the design. It is the design, flagging what matters enough to return to. Expressive writing interventions, developed by psychologist James Pennebaker, have demonstrated in dozens of controlled trials that writing about emotionally difficult experiences produces measurable improvements in physical health, immune function, and psychological well-being. The proposed mechanism is a bridging process, translating the non-verbal, imagistic emotional record into a narrative form allows the two systems, the imagistic deeper mind and the verbal conscious, to exchange information. The result is not catharsis in the classical sense. It is integration. The emotional memory retains its informational content while losing the body's urgency to resolve it. The symbol finds its sentence. The role of narrative in emotional processing extends beyond therapeutic contexts. Research in developmental psychology has found that parents who narrate their children's emotional experiences, describing what the child appears to be feeling, placing the feeling in context, creating a story around the experience, produce children with more coherent autobiographical memory and greater emotional regulation capacity. The translation of imagistic emotional experience into verbal narrative is not a luxury. It is a developmental task. The ability to tell the story of what happened to you is built from thousands of early iterations of someone helping you find words for what the deeper mind already knew. Sleep deprivation selectively impairs the prefrontal cortex's capacity to modulate limbic responses. Studies have consistently found that after insufficient sleep, emotional reactivity increases. The amygdala shows larger responses to emotionally significant stimuli, and the prefrontal modulation that ordinarily dampens the response is reduced. What this means in practical terms is that sleep deprivation shifts the balance toward the older, more reactive system. The pre-verbal mind, already the more ancient and more immediate layer, becomes proportionally louder. The images and feelings that were being managed become harder to manage. The language the deeper mind speaks when tired is less filtered and more urgent. The placebo effect is, in part, a demonstration of the power of imagistic communication to the deeper mind. When a patient takes a pill they believe to be effective, measurable physiological changes occur. Changes in neurochemistry, immune function, pain perception, and autonomic regulation that cannot be explained by the inert substance alone. The ritual of treatment, the authority of the provider, the symbol of the medicine. These communicate to the pre-verbal processing system that healing is occurring. The deeper mind responds with real physiological change. This is not delusion. It is the imagistic system doing what it does, receiving the image of the outcome and beginning to activate the pathways that produce it. The insula, a cortical region buried within the lateral sulcus, is involved in interoception, the sensing of internal bodily states, and in the awareness of emotional feeling. Research has found that the insula is active during the experience of emotions, during the observation of others in emotional states, and during the processing of imagistic representations of emotional content, including music and art. The insula is sometimes described as the site where the body's signals become feelings. It is also the region where the deeper body language, the tightening, the warmth, the hollow feeling, becomes available, if briefly, to conscious awareness. The body's signals pass through here. Studies on the neuroscience of creativity have found that the most generative phase of creative problem-solving is associated with default mode network activity, the same network active during rest, mind wandering, and imagistic processing. This insight period, often experienced as the sudden arrival of a solution, correlates with a burst of activity in the right temporal lobe that precedes conscious awareness of the solution by measurable milliseconds. The answer arrives from below. The pre-verbal system assembled the elements, the fragments, the images, the partial patterns, into the solution before the verbal, sequential mind could construct the same result. Creative insight is the deeper language being listened to. Recurring dreams, the same scenario returning across weeks, months, or years, have been studied as indicators of unresolved emotional processing. Research using sleep laboratory methods has found that recurring dream themes correlate with waking emotional concerns that have not been integrated into the autobiographical narrative. The deeper mind returns to the material it has not finished processing. The dream is not a random replay. It is the system scheduling another pass at the encoding task. When the waking emotional material is processed and integrated, the recurring dream typically resolves. The language the pre-verbal mind was speaking finally received a listener. The discovery that the gut's enteric nervous system contains approximately 100 million neurons operates semi-independently of the central nervous system and communicates bidirectionally with the brain via the vagus nerve has added a visceral dimension to the understanding of imagistic processing. Gut feelings are not metaphors. The gut-brain axis transmits affective signals, states of unease, approach, motivation, or avoidance that reach limbic processing areas without passing through verbal cortex. The felt sense of something being wrong before you know what it is originates partly in this gut-brain signal stream. The deeper language has a second speaker, the one below the diaphragm. Evidence from neurodegenerative conditions provides another window into the relationship between imagistic and verbal cognition. Individuals in early stages of semantic dementia, which selectively damages the verbal knowledge system, often retain emotional and imagistic responsiveness, responding to music, to familiar features, to symbolic objects, long after the ability to name these things is lost. The emotional imagistic layer outlasts the verbal layer. This dissociation suggests that the two systems, while deeply intertwined in healthy cognition, have distinct neural substrates. The processing that carries emotional meaning is not secondary to the language that names it. It is prior, separate, and, as it turns out, more durable. Something is still with you. Take a slow breath. Notice how the thinking has softened, the kind of softening that happens when something you already know starts to feel more like yours. We're wandering through the mind's own language together, the part that runs deeper than the sentences you can say aloud. There's no rush, no translation required. Let's continue. The way children acquire language offers a clue about how the imagistic and verbal systems come to operate in tandem. Before children have words, they have symbolic play, using one object to represent another, enacting scenarios, creating characters. This representational capacity, which emerges around 18 months, is considered a precursor to language rather than a consequence of it. The ability to let one thing stand for another, the foundational operation of imagery, develops before the verbal machinery to name it. Language is built on top of an imagistic architecture that was already functional. The child uses symbols before they speak them. Trauma alters the relationship between the imagistic and verbal processing systems in specific and well-documented ways. Bessel van der Kolk's research and subsequent work by many others have established that traumatic memories are encoded differently from ordinary memories, with less hippocampal contextual processing and more amygdala-driven sensory-emotional imprinting. The result is a memory that is more imagistic, more body-based, and less available to verbal narration. The traumatic event is held in the pre-verbal register, as image, as sensation, as emotional response, often without a retrievable narrative. The deeper mind holds what the verbal system was not equipped to encode at the time. EMDR, eye movement, desensitization and reprocessing, is a trauma therapy approach developed by Francine Shapiro that uses side-to-side sensory stimulation while the client holds the traumatic image in mind. It has been validated in multiple randomized controlled trials and is recommended by the World Health Organization for the treatment of PTSD. The proposed mechanism involves the sensory stimulation facilitating the transfer of traumatic material from amygdala-dominant encoding to hippocampal contextual processing, allowing the imagistic, body-held memory to be integrated into a narrative. The treatment works through the imagistic channel rather than through verbal analysis. The image is processed by altering how it is held, not what it says. The experience of insight meditation, the practice of observing mental content without attachment, has been studied neurologically and found to be associated with changes in default mode network functioning. Long-term meditators show reduced automatic self-referential processing and increased self-awareness. What this means for the pre-verbal mind is that meditation trains the observer, the part that notices the images without immediately translating or dismissing them. The feelings and half-formed impressions of the deeper processing system become available for a longer moment of recognition before the verbal layer labels and moves on. The practice is, in part, learning to sit with the language before insisting on a translation. Sound symbolism, the non-arbitrary relationship between the sounds of words and their meanings, has been documented across unrelated languages. The phenomenon, sometimes called the Buba-Kiki effect, demonstrates that when people are shown a smooth, rounded shape and a sharp, jagged shape alongside the nonsense words Buba and Kiki, the vast majority, regardless of language background, match Buba to the round shape and Kiki to the sharp one. The sounds carry meaning through the pre-verbal processing of their acoustic properties, independent of any taught vocabulary. The way certain intervals and progressions carry emotional weight appears to be partly built in, a feature of the shared acoustic emotional language. Phantom limb phenomena, in which amputees continue to experience sensation in limbs that are no longer present, illuminate how the body is represented in the brain. The somatosensory cortex maintains a map of the body, the homunculus, that reflects learned embodied experience rather than current anatomical reality. The brain continues to represent what was true of the body long after it has changed. This principle extends to emotional experience. The brain maintains imagistic maps of relational and emotional structures, ways of being that have been deeply learned, even when the original context is gone. The body map the deeper mind holds carries the past forward. Research on embodied simulation, the brain's tendency to internally simulate the states, actions, and experiences of others during observation, suggests that empathy is fundamentally an imagistic process. When you watch someone in pain, regions associated with your own pain experience activate. When you observe someone reaching for an object, motor cortex regions associated with your own reaching activate. Understanding others, at its neural base, is not abstract inference. It is imagistic reenactment, running the other person's experience in your own system. The deeper mind does not separate the observed from the experienced. It simulates. The image of the other becomes a felt state in the self. The neuroscience of awe, that complex emotion triggered by encounters with vastness, complexity, or significance that exceeds the current mental frame, has been studied as a specific state with distinct physiological and neural correlates. Awe is associated with activation of the anterior insular and anterior cingulate cortex. Reduced activity in the default mode network's self-referential regions follows. In some studies, Elevation of vagal tone markers associated with social connection and safety also appears. What matters here is the mechanism. Awe is triggered when something present exceeds what language can contain. The deeper mind is the first system to recognize when something is larger than words. The images that appear in religious and spiritual traditions across cultures share structural features with the images the brain generates during dreaming and altered states. The descent and return, the dissolution and reconstitution of the self, the encounter with a larger order. Anthropologists and cognitive scientists studying the cross-cultural emergence of these themes have proposed that they reflect the architecture of certain neural states, particularly states induced by fasting, sensory deprivation, rhythmic activity, or psychedelic compounds, rather than being independent cultural inventions. The religious symbol is, in part, the brain reporting what it found when the ordinary narrative self was temporarily suspended. Halfway through the language of the pre-verbal mind, the question has changed. It began as, why does the deeper system speak in images rather than words? The answer has been accumulating since the first fact. Because the imagistic system is older, faster, more directly connected to the body, and more densely integrated with emotional memory than the verbal systems that overlay it. The harder question the second half follows. What happens when the language the deeper mind has carried for a lifetime is encoding something the conscious mind learned very early to call by the wrong name? Like a feeling of failure that was at root, a feeling of not being seen. That is where the remaining facts go. What just opened? The question of what happens when the imagistic language meets the name that was given to it early and stuck is not only a neuroscience question. You may be carrying a version of it right now. An image or a feeling that has been present for a long time, longer than any explanation you've found for it. Not because the explanation is wrong, because the image was formed before the explanation existed. The second half of tonight follows the distance between the image and the name. Feel your breath. Notice that it moves whether or not that distance has closed. That is where the second half begins. Early attachment experiences shape the imagistic templates through which all subsequent relationships are perceived. Research by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, extended by decades of developmental neuroscience, has established that the quality of early caregiving creates internal working models, representations of self and other, that function as templates for interpreting relational experience throughout life. These models are encoded not primarily as verbal beliefs, but as procedural, imagistic patterns. This is what closeness feels like. This is what to expect when you need comfort. This is the shape of safety. The relational language of the deeper mind was written before you could read. The concept of schema in cognitive psychology describes stable, organized patterns of thought and perception derived from experience. Schemas operate largely below conscious awareness, shaping what is noticed, what is remembered, and what is expected. They are one of the primary structures through which the pre-verbal mind organizes its imagistic library. Research has found that schema-consistent information is processed more rapidly and encoded more durably than schema-inconsistent information. The imagistic templates, built from early and repeated experience, become the lens through which later experience is first interpreted. Before the verbal reasoning system has the chance to apply analysis. The inner critic, the recurring internal voice that evaluates, judges, and anticipates failure, has been studied as a distinct cognitive mode associated with increased activation of the medial prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex. Research has found that the severity of self-critical thinking is associated with early experiences of conditional approval and threat in close relationships. The inner critic is not simply a thought. It is an imagistic structure, an internalized model of a relational dynamic, that the pre-verbal system continues to run as a background process. The voice was learned from a script that no longer has a living author. Cognitive reappraisal, the deliberate reframing of emotional experience through changed verbal interpretation, has been validated as an effective emotion regulation strategy. Neuroimaging studies show that successful reappraisal is associated with increased prefrontal activation and decreased amygdala response. What is less often emphasized is the limit of this strategy. Reappraisal operates on the verbal representation of the experience, not on the underlying imagistic encoding. The amygdala's original response, shaped by earlier learning, remains. Reappraisal modulates it. The image that was formed early stays in the archive. The interpretation laid over it is more recent and more fragile. Research on the self-concept has found that people hold not one, but a multitude of self-representations. Current selves, ideal selves, feared selves, past selves, stored in partly overlapping, partly distinct neural networks. These multiple selves include significant imagistic and emotional components alongside verbal self-descriptions. The feared self tends to be represented in vivid, emotionally loaded, scenario-based terms, specific images of failure, rejection, or inadequacy. The pre-verbal system manages a gallery of selves that the verbal self-concept can gesture toward but not fully contain. What you say you are is a description of what the imagistic system has already built. The phenomenon of transference in therapeutic relationships, the unconscious redirection of feelings about past significant others onto the therapist, is a clinical instance of the broader principle that imagistic templates direct perception. The client does not consciously choose to relate to the therapist as they once related to a parent. The pre-verbal system pattern matches the relational image and runs the familiar response. Research in social cognition has found that subliminal priming with images of significant others alters behavior and emotional response in subsequent interactions with strangers, outside of any awareness of the link. The template applies itself without announcement. A coherent, integrated sense of self appears to be constructed through the autobiographical story a person tells about their life. According to research in personality, psychology, and developmental neuroscience, Dan McAdams and colleagues have found that people who construct more causally integrated life narratives show greater psychological maturity and resilience. What is significant for this hour is the inverse. When the imagistic emotional record and the verbal autobiographical narrative diverge sharply, the resulting tension is experienced as something missing in the self-story. The imagistic truth and the spoken story are not always the same account of the same life. Studies on implicit attitude, the automatic evaluations that operate below conscious awareness, have found consistent divergences between what people explicitly state they believe and what their pre-verbal responses reveal. The implicit association test and related measures have documented these divergences across hundreds of thousands of participants. The pre-verbal evaluative system was shaped by a lifetime of associative learning, including learning that occurred before verbal awareness, and learning from environments whose influence the person does not consciously acknowledge. What the imagistic system learned and what the verbal system endorses are often not the same curriculum. Near-death experiences, reported across diverse populations and studied systematically since the 1970s, share consistent imagistic elements regardless of cultural background. A passage through darkness, a light, the experience of a life review, encounters with figures, a threshold or boundary. Researchers have proposed various explanations. Neural hypoxia, REM intrusion, endogenous chemical release. But what is notable here is the content itself. When the brain operates near the edge of consciousness, with verbal systems degraded and imagistic systems still active, it generates specific, consistent narratives. The pre-verbal mind has a library of last resort images that appear to be structural, not cultural. The science of forgiveness has found that the inability to forgive correlates with persistent activation of the anterior cingulate cortex's conflict monitoring function. The brain continues to flag the discrepancy between what happened and what should have happened. Forgiveness is associated not with verbal redescription of the event, but with a shift in the emotional imagistic encoding. The image of the person or event is no longer automatically associated with threat or injury at the limbic level. Research on forgiveness interventions suggests that this shift requires engaging the imagistic emotional system directly, not simply revising the verbal account. The imagistic re-encoding precedes the words for it. Psychosomatic research has documented the specific bodily locations in which different emotional experiences tend to be felt across cultures. Studies by Lauri Numenma and colleagues at the University of Turku, replicating across Finnish, Swedish, and Taiwanese participants, found consistent body maps for basic and complex emotions. Warmth in the chest for love, heaviness in the limbs for depression, heat in the upper body for anger. These are not randomly distributed. They are the body's language for emotional state, so consistent across populations that the map appears to be partly universal. The body always knew where the feeling was. The words came later. Research on the psychology of awe has found that experiences of awe reliably produce what psychologists call small self, a temporary decrease in the subjective sense of one's own importance and a corresponding increase in connectedness to something larger. This state is associated with reduced activity in the default mode's self-referential regions and increased prosocial behavior. What is relevant here is the mechanism. Awe is produced when a symbol, the night sky, the ocean, a piece of music, an act of profound kindness, overwhelms the usual imagistic frame of self-importance. The pre-verbal system registers scale by dissolving the images that usually maintain its own centrality. The state produced by compounds like psilocybin, LSD, and DMT involves a dramatic increase in imagistic and associative processing alongside a disruption of the default mode network's ordinarily constrained activity. Clinical trials at Johns Hopkins, New, and Imperial College London have found that carefully supervised psilocybin sessions produce lasting reductions in depression, anxiety, and addiction in a significant proportion of participants. Researchers have proposed that the therapeutic effect involves a temporary loosening of fixed imagistic templates, a period during which the pre-verbal system's usual automatic associations become malleable. The imagistic system is not erased. It becomes, briefly, editable. Synesthesia, when stimulation, in one sense, automatically and involuntarily produces experience in another, reveals that the imagistic architecture of the pre-verbal mind extends to the sensory level. For synesthetes, letters have colors, sounds have shapes, numbers have spatial positions. These associations are automatic, consistent, and largely inaccessible to voluntary control. Research estimates that some form of synesthesia occurs in approximately 3 to 4% of the population. Though milder forms of cross-modal association are likely more widespread, the pre-verbal mind encodes sensory information in a more interconnected, image-like network than sequential verbal processing suggests. By this point in the journey, the evidence has been consistent. The pre-verbal mind does not speak in words because it operates in the register that precedes and underlies words. The imagistic, body-based, associative layer where emotional memory, pattern recognition, and relational templates are encoded and maintained. The images it produces are not obscure. They are direct. The body tightening, the recurring dream, the image that carries weight without explanation, the feeling of something known before the knowing becomes sayable. The question that remains is not whether this language is real. It is whether the person who lives in words is learning to listen to the one who speaks in images. Music composed in a minor key is consistently perceived as conveying sadness or melancholy across cultures, while major key music is perceived as conveying happiness or resolution. This cross-cultural consistency, documented in research with populations as isolated as the Mafa people of Cameroon, who had no prior exposure to Western music, suggests that the emotional response to harmonic structure is not purely learned. The pre-verbal mind processes certain acoustic patterns as emotionally meaningful in ways that precede musical education. The way certain intervals and progressions carry emotional weight appears to be partly built in a feature of the shared acoustic emotional language. The literature on contemplative neuroscience has found that sustained meditation practice alters the brain's default mode network in ways that reduce automatic narrative self-referential processing. What meditators describe as a shift in their relationship to their own thoughts maps onto measurable changes in network connectivity and reactivity. The imagistic content, the images, the feelings, the impressions, does not disappear with practice. What changes is the automatic verbal commentary that follows each imagistic event. The image is allowed to be present without immediately becoming a sentence about what it means. The pre-verbal language is heard without instant translation. The concept of felt sense, developed by Eugene Gendlin in his work on the therapeutic process, describes the bodily felt impression that arises when attention is brought to a complex emotional concern. The felt sense is not an emotion with a name. It is the pre-verbal mind's holistic encoding of a situation, held in the body, available to awareness when language relaxes its grip. Gendlin's research found that therapeutic sessions that included reference to the felt sense produced more lasting change than sessions that proceeded exclusively through verbal analysis. The image held in the body knew something the verbal account was not yet saying. Research on embodied simulation suggests that observing another person's expressive behavior, their posture, their gesture, their expression, activates corresponding states in your own motor and emotional systems before verbal interpretation occurs. Understanding another person begins in the body, in the pre-verbal system, in the imagistic enactment of their state in your own system. The deeper mind does not separate the observed from the experienced. It simulates. Empathy speaks the language of the image before the language of the sentence, and by the time the verbal mind forms an interpretation, the pre-verbal response has already begun. Sleep architecture research has found that the dreams most likely to be remembered upon waking are those occurring close to the morning wake time, during the lengthening REM periods of the later sleep cycle. The content of these late-night dreams tends to be more elaborate, emotionally complex, and narratively coherent than earlier night REM dreams. This is also the period during which the memory consolidation system is most actively processing the previous day's emotional content. The most memorable dreams are not random. They are the pre-verbal mind completing its most careful encoding work, the most complex imagistic operations, at the point where consciousness is about to return. The neuroscience of hope has found that the subjective state of hope involves activation of both the limbic system's reward circuitry and the prefrontal cortex's prospective thinking regions. Hope is not pure emotion. It is an imagistic state, an image of a possible future, held with emotional investment. Research on hope theory, developed by C. R. Snyder, distinguishes between willpower, the motivation to pursue a goal, and way power, the ability to imagine pathways toward it. Both require holding images of what does not yet exist. Hope is the pre-verbal mind speaking about the future, the image of something not yet here, held as if it were already close. The phenomenon of thin slicing, accurate judgment, based on very brief exposure to limited information, demonstrates that the pre-verbal system processes relational and emotional cues at extraordinary speed. Nalini Ambadi's research found that students' evaluations of teachers' effectiveness based on 30-second silent video clips correlated significantly with end-of-semester evaluations. The pre-verbal system was reading the language of gesture, posture, facial expression, and proximity, all imagistic, non-verbal channels, and generating accurate assessments before any deliberate analysis occurred. What the pre-verbal mind reads in 30 seconds, the verbal mind might take a semester to articulate. Color environments appear to influence physiological state through the pre-verbal processing of the chromatic setting. Research has found that exposure to red light increases arousal and sympathetic nervous system activation, while blue and green environments are associated with lower heart rate and cortisol levels. These effects operate through the pre-verbal evaluation of the color. The limbic response runs ahead of any verbal awareness of what is in the room. The space you are in speaks to the deeper mind in a language of light before any word is formed about it. The evaluation has already happened before you know it has. Laughter, particularly the spontaneous, involuntary laughter triggered by genuine surprise, is one of the clearest examples of the pre-verbal system communicating through the body before the verbal mind has processed what happened. The neural pathway from surprise to laughter is fast, subcortical, and not under voluntary control. The body expresses the resolution, the sudden reframe, the unexpected connection. The gap between expectation and outcome suddenly closed, before the verbal mind has finished processing the content. Humor operates in the imagistic register. The laugh is the pre-verbal response to an image arriving with more speed or incongruity than the verbal system anticipated. The language of the pre-verbal mind is not a mystery waiting to be solved. It is the primary cognitive language, older than speech, more deeply integrated with the body, more directly connected to what was learned before words existed to name it. The images it speaks, the recurring theme, the felt sense, the body's response before the mind has caught up, are not secondary expressions of something that could be said more precisely in sentences. They are the more precise record. The capacity to receive this language, to let an image be present without insisting on its translation, is perhaps the most fundamental form of self-understanding available. You might feel tired now. That is perfectly fine. Breathe slowly. Let the facts settle. Every image this hour has offered, every felt sense that surfaced and passed, every moment of recognition that arrived and didn't need a name, is being received somewhere below the threshold of your attention. Sorted, held filed in the archive that works without your supervision. The pre-verbal system does not need you to stay awake for its work. It only needs the quiet. You are already inside that quiet now. We're almost there. The pre-verbal mind holds the earliest memories. The brain forms procedural and emotional memories from birth, long before the hippocampal structures for explicit, verbally accessible memory are sufficiently developed. This means the emotional imagistic record begins before the story does. Some of what shapes a person most, the earliest registered experiences of safety, threat, warmth, or absence, exists only in this register, without a narrative that can be consciously retrieved. The archive is older than the autobiography. The language began before the speaker knew they were speaking. The parasympathetic nervous system, the branch associated with rest and recovery, is activated by imagistic cues of safety as much as by actual physical safety. Research drawing on polyvagal theory, proposed by Stephen Porges, suggests that the ventral vagal system may respond to cues in the environment: voice tone, facial expression, rhythm, spaciousness, that signal social safety, processed before conscious evaluation. The body begins to rest when the deeper language of the environment says it is safe. This moment is one of those signals. The act of naming, giving a word to a feeling or impression that has previously been wordless, is associated with a measurable reduction in limbic reactivity. Matthew Lieberman's research at UCLA demonstrated that labeling an emotional experience reduced amygdala activation compared to viewing the same stimulus without labeling. The word does not replace the image. It accompanies it. And in the accompaniment, something of the body's urgency releases. When the pre-verbal language finds its word, something in the system breathes easier. The experience of being fully understood by another person activates the brain's reward circuitry in ways that overlap with other primary rewards. Research on therapeutic alliance has consistently found it to be the strongest predictor of therapeutic outcome across modalities. Being understood means having the imagistic language of one's inner life received without distortion. The images, the feelings, the half-formed impressions taken seriously rather than immediately translated into someone else's vocabulary. The deepest connection is one mind receiving the pre-verbal language of another as it is. Animal research has provided some of the most direct evidence for the evolutionary antiquity of the imagistic emotional system. Studies in comparative neuroscience have found that mammals share the neural structures amygdala, hippocampus, anterior cingulate, insula, most centrally involved in emotional processing. Rats dream, consolidating navigational experiences in sleep. Elephants appear to engage in grief rituals. Chimpanzees exhibit behavior consistent with awareness of others' inner states. The language the pre-verbal mind speaks is not uniquely human. It is the common inheritance of creatures with emotional nervous systems. Studies on gratitude have found that the practice of attending to specific positive experiences, not generic appreciation, but the felt quality of particular moments, is associated with increases in well-being, improved sleep quality, and reduced symptoms of depression. The mechanism appears to involve deliberate engagement with the imagistic emotional register, bringing the body-based memory of a positive experience into sustained attention. The pre-verbal mind is being given something to consolidate during sleep. Gratitude practice is a way of choosing which images the deeper mind works with in the dark. The body's stress response is mediated by imagistic evaluation. The same objective situation, a steep cliff, a public presentation, a confrontational conversation, produces vastly different physiological responses depending on the evaluation the brain assigns to it. Research by Wendy Mendez has found that framing a challenging situation as a threat versus a challenge alters the cardiovascular and hormonal response profile. How the situation is held in the pre-verbal system, as danger or as opportunity, determines how the body responds before any deliberate decision is made. The ability to find meaning in adversity is one of the most robust predictors of post-traumatic growth and resilience. This process is fundamentally an imagistic one, transforming the image of a painful event into one that carries, alongside the pain, a quality of depth or connection. The event does not change. The imagistic encoding of it changes. Research by Crystal Park and others has documented this as a shift from one's overall sense of how life works to the specific encoding of a particular experience. The image is rewritten. Compassion, the capacity to feel another's suffering as motivation to relieve it, involves distinct neural activation patterns from empathy, where empathy recruits simulation of the other's suffering. Compassion adds activation of positive affect and motivation circuits. The Dalai Lama's collaboration with Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin produced data suggesting compassion can be trained. That compassionate intention, when cultivated deliberately, alters neural response to suffering. The training works through the imagistic register, changing the image held when confronting another's pain from overwhelm to the possibility of care. The science of awe has extended to what researchers call threat-based awe. The experience of confronting something that dwarfs the self uncomfortably rather than inspiringly. Both positive awe and threat-based awe activate similar neural pathways and produce the small self effect. The difference lies in the imagistic framing. The same vastness of the night sky can be encountered as wonder or as insignificance, depending on the context the pre-verbal system provides. The image is the same. The meaning it carries, safety or threat, is written below the level of words. Research on intergenerational trauma has found evidence of inherited biological shifts through which the emotional imagistic encoding of a parent's trauma may influence the stress reactivity of their children. Studies of Holocaust survivors' children and descendants of enslaved people have found measurable differences in cortisol regulation and amygdala reactivity. The pre-verbal language carries, in some sense, beyond the individual life. The archive is longer than one person's story. What is held in the body has, in some cases, been passed through the body. The practice of imagery rehearsal therapy for nightmares, re-scripting the imagery of recurring distressing dreams, has been validated in clinical trials as an effective treatment for nightmare disorder and PTSD-related nightmares. The therapy asks the person to create a new ending for the dream, to rewrite the image. The fact that changing the imagined version changes the dream experience provides direct evidence that the imagistic language of the pre-verbal mind is not fixed. The image can be authored. The archive can be revised, one image at a time. Lullabies exist in every culture that has been studied. The features are consistent. Slow tempo, simple repetitive melodic pattern, soft timbre, often with nonsense syllables alongside words. The consistent features suggest that the lullaby speaks to the pre-verbal system rather than the conscious receiver. The infant does not understand the words, but the imagistic affective language, warmth, repetition, the nearness of a calm caregiver, communicates safety and permission to release into sleep. What the lullaby says to the deeper mind: the danger is past. You can go now. The experience of nostalgia, the bittersweet sense of longing for a past time, has been studied neurologically and found to involve activation of memory consolidation regions alongside the reward system. Nostalgia is not simply remembering. It is the imagistic reconstruction of a past state that felt more complete or more connected than the present. Research has found that nostalgia restores a sense of meaning, social connectedness, and self-continuity. The pre-verbal system retrieves the image of what was whole as a resource for what feels fragmented now. Loving kindness meditation, deliberately generating feelings of warmth and goodwill towards self and others, has been found to produce increases in positive affect, reduced implicit bias, and improved vagal tone. The practice operates through the imagistic register. The meditator holds an image of the other person in mind while cultivating the felt sense of warmth. The image carries the practice. The verbal intention alone, without the image and the felt sense, does not produce the same outcome. The pre-verbal mind requires the image, not only the instruction. The final movement of any language is towards silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of sufficiency, when what needed to be said has been said in the only form it could be said in. The pre-verbal mind reaches this silence in the deepest phase of sleep, when the imagistic work of the night is complete and the brain settles into dreamless slow-wave sleep. No image, no narrative, just the quiet work of restoration, which requires no language. The deepest rest is the pause after the last image settles. Research on wonder, the sustained engagement with something intriguing, distinct from the sudden overwhelm of awe, has found it associated with sustained dopaminergic activity and increased prefrontal to default mode connectivity. Wonder involves the pre-verbal mind fully engaged without urgency, present to an image without needing immediate resolution. The slow facts, the lengthening silences between them, the images that arrive without demanding to be named. This is the state toward which tonight has been moving. Wonder is what the pre-verbal mind sounds like when it is not afraid. The experience of falling asleep, hypnagogia, involves a state in which voluntary control relaxes and imagery-generating systems operate more freely. hypnagogic images are vivid, sudden, disconnected. Faces, landscapes, fragments of scenes. It is the threshold where the analytical mind releases its hold and the imagistic system surfaces without narrative. Many people who work with imagery or meditation have learned to rest here deliberately, to listen as the pre-verbal mind begins, freely, to speak. What surfaces there is often precisely what was waiting to be noticed. Sleep research has established that the glymphatic system, the brain's proposed waste clearance network, appears most active during slow wave, deep sleep. Research in animal models suggests that during this phase, cerebrospinal fluid flows through the spaces between neurons, clearing metabolic byproducts, including proteins associated with neurodegenerative disease. Both the imagistic processing of REM and the structural maintenance of slow-wave sleep require the same condition. The release of voluntary consciousness. The brain may repair itself in the same condition that allows the pre-verbal mind to speak most clearly. The word conscious derives from Latin consciere, to know together. Consciousness, in its fullest sense, is not only the verbal, sequential awareness most people identify as their thinking mind. It includes the imagistic, body-based awareness of the pre-verbal system, the older, faster, more directly connected layer. To be fully conscious is to know together. Sentence and image, story and the feeling held below it, listening to one another in the quiet when neither insists it is the only voice. The archive the pre-verbal mind maintains does not require management tonight. It is doing what it always does during sleep. Sorting, consolidating, filing. The emotional signatures are being updated. The pattern-matching templates are being refined. The imagistic library is receiving what the day provided, making new connections in the quiet that wakefulness rarely allows. Nothing is lost in this process. Everything that needed to be kept is being kept. Everything that needed to be released is already releasing. The work is underway, and you are not required to supervise it. Across the research this hour gathered, from the amygdala's image before word encoding to the hippocampus's pattern completion, from somatic vocabulary to the lullaby's grammar of safety, the same structure appears. The language of the pre-verbal mind is thought's first and most fundamental form. Everything layered above it, the sentence, the narrative, the self-concept held in words, is built upon this older foundation. Tonight, the foundation is acknowledged. The language does not require translation to be received. It only requires the quiet in which it can be heard. The emotional weight of an image is not fixed. Research on memory reconsolidation suggests that the images the pre-verbal mind holds can be altered by what they meet during their brief period of openness. When a retrieved memory becomes temporarily open to revision before being restored, what enters the deeper system during the quiet hours of the night? The feeling of safety in the body. The images offered by an hour like this one, becomes part of what surrounds them when they return to storage. The archive is not sealed. The last image the mind generates before sleep is, in some research, the most durably encoded of the night's final waking moments. What you hold in the imagistic register at the edge of sleep shapes the first sleep cycles. The pre-verbal system is most receptive at the threshold. What is present there, in image, in felt sense, in the tone of the body, shapes the night's encoding work. Tonight, what is present is the language of your own deeper mind, given a quiet space to be recognized. The brain encodes emotion as image before it finds the word for it. Not because the image is less precise, but because the image is more complete. It carries context, sensation, and relational meaning in a single gesture that no sentence can fully replicate. The pre-verbal mind was never waiting to be translated. It was always waiting to be received. What you have carried without being able to name it is held in a language older than naming. Patient, detailed, already speaking. Tonight, it was heard. 100 facts ago, the pre-verbal mind was a language no one had quite decoded. Now we know it was never encrypted. We followed the amygdala's image before the word, the hippocampus completing its patterns in the dark. We watched the body carry what the sentence could not hold, in the tightening of the chest, the recurring image, the felt sense that arrived before its name. What began as a question about why the deeper system speaks in images became something closer to an answer about what speaking truly is. The language was never hidden. It was the first one. The one everything else was built upon. The brain encodes emotion as image because the image is the more complete record. What you have been carrying, without the right words for it, was never wordless. It was spoken in a language that predates language. And tonight, in the quiet, something in the deeper system has been listening to itself. Perhaps tonight's journey through the mind's own language brought something into focus that had been slightly out of reach. A gentle like, subscribe, or share helps another quiet soul find their way here. One quiet tap for everyone still searching for the way here. Right now, the imagistic encoding systems of your brain are receiving what this hour has offered. Not to be analyzed, to be held, the way the amygdala holds an emotional signature. Quietly, faithfully, below the level of what needs to be said about it. Let your entire being dissolve into that holding. The pre-verbal mind does not require your attention to continue its work. It is already working. You can allow these thoughts to settle now, like images completing their encoding and returning to the quiet archive they came from. Let your body grow heavy with the work that is already underway. Sleep carries you into the part of the language that runs without words, the place where the consolidation happens and the images find their final form for tonight. Another hour on this channel follows a thread tonight didn't reach, waiting for you in the video description whenever you're ready. But if your eyes are closed, Stay there. Rest well. Careful one. The language knew you were listening. Where science becomes the softest place to rest. Good night.